Clausewitz is perhaps one of the most important philosophers of the 19th century. This is not often heard. Usually when people talk about philosophers, they would talk about people like, Kant, Schopenhauer, even Hegel. Some people think Hegel is an important philosopher, which it's nonsense and bullshit. But anyways, but not so many people talk about Clausewitz as philosopher. He wrote perhaps one of the most interesting books of the 19th century. He wrote a book called On War, which probably if you end up watching this video, you already know this book. Now, there are tons of videos on YouTube about Karl von Clausewitz, but really none of them talk about in depth about his philosophy. Usually, they end up quoting him and talking about some basic concepts. For example, they would talk about the concept of fog, the concept of friction, and they would talk about his definition of war as a political, as a mean towards an end, and that end is entirely political. We will discuss this in this video as well. But in the end, like every single video on YouTube about Karl von Clausewitz is basically the same video again and again when they talk about all these concepts that basically is like reading quickly the Wikipedia page. And I feel like there is no single video that talks in depth about the whole content of the chapters and the whole vision of the war. And again, I think his work is perhaps one of the most interesting works of the 19th century. And look, I'm reading the book in German. This is from Kriege. This is the German edition. This is a full edition. I don't know if you can see that this book is huge. It's almost as thick as my bloody head. And so, no one could ever write a book as big as this that could be put into like 2-3 quotes and some vague sentences concerning what war is. So there is a lot of things here. There are a lot of things, and usually people, when they read Clausewitz, they tend to read Clausewitz because they are maybe studying military, they are in the military, the academy or whatever, and they want to see Clausewitz through the lenses of what can be used or saved today. For example, I don't know, can we still define war as Clausewitz is? Yes, we can. What concepts are still in use in the military world? And then, yes, of course, Clausewitz was a 19th century author that lived, in the 19th century, and obviously we cannot keep using a 19th century author in modern warfare. It doesn't make sense. There are still things that is still in the vocabulary, that are still in use. For example, the concept of friction, the concept of fog are still used by many strategists, and you will see tons of videos of YouTube with generals and strategists talking about those concepts. But still, I want to focus this series of videos, of which this is the first. I want to focus these videos on Clausewitz's philosophy, regardless of whether it is used today or not. I want to talk about Clausewitz. I want to talk about this huge book that clearly cannot be reduced to a couple of quotes, some key concepts, and that's it. It's more than 1,000 pages. More than 1,000 bloody pages. It cannot be reduced only to that. There must be more to it than, the usual thing. We tend to classify books, for example, by Machiavelli. We tend to classify, for example, his Art of War. Machiavelli wrote a book called The Art of War. We tend to classify those books into politics, and if he were to classify his own work, he's constantly talking about how war is a means to an end, and that end is always political. Is the use war is basically a tool that states have in order to achieve a goal. And his work is not about whether you should use war or not, it's about the war itself, regardless of the whole ethical thing, which is very important, because war, usually we have books about, books that talk about the craft of war, if that expression is accurate. For example, The Art of War of Machiavelli, we could classify that book in that manner. It's like an instruction. It's instruction. Like you are going to go to war. You can have these very interesting ideas in order to succeed in your battle. And the same we could say about Sun Tzu's The Art of War, which is again another important book, but it's more like instructions. Like if you want to win your war, you have here those key concepts. But Clausewitz does way more than that. Clausewitz is a reflection, is a deep reflection on the activity itself, and we are going today to see just chapter 1 of his book on war, and chapter 1 is absolutely fascinating. The book is written really diligently, I mean in depth. I will show the index so you can actually see the whole content, because most of the people haven't actually read the book. They know about Clausewitz, they haven't seen how much detail is put into this work and how much work was put into this work. We have to consider that Clausewitz lived through the Napoleonic Wars and basically made his own experience, as well as his own education in history and so on. That he put all that, both education and life experiences, into this magnificent book that is very, very detailed and full in depth with all the aspects of war. As you can see, it's extensive, it's huge. This thing is huge. This is the index of the book, and it's absolutely huge. And the book is divided into 8 books, each of them containing several chapters, and 2 of them, the book 7 and book 8, are just sketches. This book was supposed to be larger than what already is. It was supposed to be larger than this. So chapter 1, now we begin properly with reading of the chapter. I'm going to talk about exclusively chapter 1, and we will see just with chapter 1 how many things are there to appreciate and to think about in just one single chapter of this amazing book. So we begin chapter 1 with a definition of war. What is war? This definition that is going to be very quoted and so on, is basically war is an act of violence that is directed towards an enemy because we need to make the enemy do something that the enemy doesn't want to. We force our enemy to do our will. So it's a mean to an end. Now we face the problem. It's a violent act. But again, Clausewitz is not just doesn't want just to give a definition. This definition on its own is alright, I guess. But the thing is that he wants to go philosophical on it. So is there a reason behind that violence? That is there a logic to the violence? We have to think. He's not talking about the ethical questions of war. That's not the point. That is for the politician to decide. I don't know if you understand this, that war is just a tool. Therefore, the person that is in charge of deciding whether war is the appropriate mean or not to achieve and end is entirely political. This is for the politician. The concern of war is war itself and not the choice of the war existing or happening. That is for the politician. So if we think philosophically now about the act of the violence itself, we need to consider, and this is what Clausewitz tells us, is there a logic to the violence? And the answer is yes. Clausewitz thinks there's a logic to that violence. That logic is established in a concept that in German is the Wechselwirkung. That is the reciprocal action. If we want to make a proper translation, I think it's translated as reciprocal action or reciprocal effect, if we want. Wirkung is usually the effect, the consequences, and Wechsel, he has this idea of being reciprocal. So because in violence, when we talk in violence in war, we are going to see this Wechselwirkung work in three different ways, and these three different ways are the three rules, so to say, that govern the violence in war. Number one, there's no limit to the amount of force that we can do to our enemy, and the enemy will do the same. That's why we call this Wechselwirkung. There is a reciprocal action. We do as much violence as we can, but the enemy can also make us suffer as much as he or she can. Once we start a conflict, we basically give our enemy the right to attack us with as much violence as the enemy considers appropriate, and we do the same. Once we start the conflict, we are in a position where we can do as much violence as we consider necessary. It's the rule, so to say, number one. And consider that it's a reciprocal thing. He can do it. The moment we start, I can do it. The opposite can as well happen. Rule number two to this, to the logic of the violence. Until my enemy is fully disarmed or in a position when he cannot attack any longer, the enemy can still defeat me. That is, and vice versa. The enemy can still be beaten if I'm able to use. If I am not yet unarmed, I can still defeat my enemy. And the third rule of this logic of the violence is that we are always estimating what our enemy is doing. We are always calculating. We are always trying to gather as much information as possible in order to try to calculate, to make an estimation of the enemy's force. And the opposite also happens. So as we make our plans for the exercise of our violence, the enemy is doing as well its own calculations in order to exercise the violence on us. So there is always this reciprocity. Each action has so to say like a reciprocal action that affects us. So it's not an isolated act. It's always this movement of coming back and forth. Now we keep on exploring with Clausewitz this whole concept. So we now know, okay, so war is a violent act that is directed against an enemy, and because we want something, we have a political end. Okay, now what characteristics have this war? We now know, we have explored the idea of violence, but now in war itself, we can still see what characteristics can we talk about. First of all, it's not an isolated act. It's not a single movement. For each movement, we have a consequence, and these consequences happen in a duration. There is a duration in war. There is time happening. Time is a huge factor. Wars take time. And another aspect is, because the goal is political, the goal is going to affect how much violence, how much energy, how much manpower or resources I'm going to invest in this goal. The importance, the strategic importance of the goal is going to determine the amount of sacrifice I'm willing to make. Here, Clausewitz introduces a very important concept. Again, I've been talking about these key concepts in German, and I will keep doing so because I think it's important to know these concepts in its original language. And here the concept is äußersten Anstrengung, which can be roughly translated as maximum effort. We could say that we reach maximum effort when we invest all resources, that is, all the produces of our land or people, the whole country as a thing. We invested all the economy, all the people, all the land, and everything we have from our own allies. We invest everything in that effort. When this happens is when we have maximum effort. Now, what we don't want to do, this is again Clausewitz talking, what we don't want to do is to spend that effort. We never want to start a war in maximum effort. Why? Again, we return to what we have seen before. War is not an isolated act, and time plays a very important key role. So we cannot waste every resource we have day one, because it's not going to last one bloody day. It's going to last an entire war, can take years, can take decades. So we want to be as farther away from maximum effort as possible. We want to invest the minimum resources for achieving the maximum result. It's an efficiency question. We want to invest the minimum to get the maximum. Now we come to a concept that is going to come later on, the concept of Stillstand. This is a very interesting concept. It's basically explaining why some wars have these periods in which there is no action. So that we have, in these wars, we have periods of military inactivity. He gives two main reasons why these detentions of military activity may happen. Number one, that we need to gather more information. We need better estimations in order to win the war, and the way to do so is detaining every military action until we have truly gathered all the information we need in order to proceed more diligently, to proceed better and to achieve better results. The second reason could be that we need to wait for a better moment. This is something that will leads us to another idea. We will see that in a moment. But yes, think that not every moment, even climatically speaking, not every season is the best season for either attacking or defending. And we may need to stop at some point and wait for a good moment for our military action. Now, Clausewitz talks about two extra factors that play a very interesting role within the act of war, and that is, first of all, luck, and the activity that we make trying to manipulate that luck and trying to get the best of it, which is the calculations of probabilities. That is, we cannot predict the future in certain aspects, but we can calculate. There is a notion of we are able to make calculations in order to at least be able to foresee certain aspects, but we cannot never really tell what is going to happen. We cannot really know. This is something that Clausewitz repeats again and again, that we cannot really know for certain what is going to happen. There is always something that may change spontaneously, something that is unpredicted, something that is entirely unforeseen, and this may affect our own calculations on our plans. So if luck plays a huge role in this, and we counteract, so to say, this luck with our own calculations, then we have another aspect, and it is the Gefährlichkeit, that is the danger. War is a dangerous activity, and people die and get wounded, and property is destroyed in wars. So it's perhaps reason number one why no one wants to go to war unless there is like an absolute necessity for it. So war is a dangerous activity, and against the danger there is another thing that humans have that counteract danger. So we have luck is counteracted by or counterbalanced by our calculations of probability, and danger is counterbalanced by boldness. Humans' emotions play a huge role in war, not only because boldness may be a very important key element in war. The morals, the spirit of the group is also a very important factor. Actually, Clausewitz counts on the spirit of the troop, or the mindset of the troop, or the high morale of the troop as one of the factors that may play as resource when making our own calculations. If we are truly more motivated than our enemy, even if we are like worse equipped than our enemy, or perhaps the enemy outnumbers our troops or whatever, Clausewitz could take the high morale of the troop, or a good mindset or good spirit in general, as part of our own resources, something that we have to put in our calculations, although we cannot truly compute it, so to say, because we cannot put numbers on it, but still we have to, is something that is still worth taking in account. So against the danger of war, human emotions can still play a huge role when counterbalancing these factors of war, that is luck and danger. So briefly, we have seen now, this is more or less the end of chapter 1. There are still key concepts, but just to make something clear, we have seen that war is a mean towards an end, that is a political goal, and we have seen that it's not an isolated act, which is a very important thing. It's not an isolated act. It's part of a huge movement that requires time. Duration is actually a huge important concept. War is going to last, we don't know exactly for much time, but is for how long, but time will play a role undoubtedly, and we have to take that in account. And now we go to another key concept, which is the tension as in the tension, the amount of he talks about it as if the amount of hatred between the peoples that are fighting. There is a national sentiment to it. There is a hatred between those people. Now, this is a very interesting thing, because he introduces the concept of abstract war or abstract warfare. I don't know exactly how the English translation of this book is translating this particular concept, but there is this idea that consider that when we talk about war, in the first instance, when we gave the definition of war provided by Clausewitz, it was a very concrete thing. We want something, we want X from our enemy. The enemy is not willing to comply to our own desires, and we decide that the only way to get X out of our enemy is to force our enemy to do or give or yield this X. So the variable is something physical and clear. In this case, war is clearly distinct from the politics. The political goals is one thing and remains entirely political, and war is just a tool we have to get to this thing. Now, when there is an element of tension, that is, when there is an element of true hatred between the nations involved in the conflict, when there is true hatred or just a strong disliking, then we go to abstract war. And what is abstract war? It's a war where the political goal identifies with the military goal, but not vice versa. Okay, so it's the political goal that is lowered to the ground of the military goal, because when abstract war happens, the political goal is the destruction of our enemy, because the utter destruction of our enemy is the goal. You see, it's not the same to think that disarming our enemy in order to force our enemy to do our will is one thing, and the destruction of our enemy because we want our enemy destroyed, that is an entirely different thing, because we don't want something, we don't want X. Now X has become the pure destruction of our enemy, which should be just a tool to get something. I don't know if I'm explaining myself. I hope I am explaining myself. I think it's clear. Clausewitz now, and I promise this is the end of it. Clausewitz closes the chapter introducing a very interesting concept which he calls the trinity of war. And it's a very interesting thing. It's not really clearly defined in the chapter. I would say that it's perhaps kind of abstract, but I think there is some sense to it because it works at different levels. So when we are talking about war is a very collective activity where the human's emotions play a role. The soul, the human nature plays a role. The soldiers, the humans involved in the actual conflict play a role, and where the generals and the politicians play a role as well. So we have first an irrational aspect, so to say, which is the feeling of enmity, the feeling of the other person being the enemy. There is a certain aspect of hatred. And this aspect, he relates this aspect with the emotional part of the human being, and in particular within the physical conflict with the people. There is the people that are involved in the country, that the peoples that are involved in the conflict. The two nations or whatever it is. Then we have the probabilities. We talked earlier about luck. So there is an element of probability happening, and this element of probability makes an activity that is closer perhaps to a game. So if we have these elements, and war has so many elements that makes it resemble more certain games. The person that is playing that game in particular is the general, is the head of the head or the heads of the army are the ones that are actually playing this game, as opposed to the person that are first in the front line and that are living the conflict on a way more emotional level. And then we have a third level, which is the third and final element of the Trinity, and that is war as an instrument. War is an instrument that requires proper understanding, and this understanding is the one that belongs to the politician. The politician is the one that has to decide whether the war is the tool that is appropriate for the political goal that needs to be achieved. So this understanding belongs to the politician. It's the politician that wants to achieve this goal, the one that needs to play a game. And for playing that game, we have a general. This general is the one that is doing the activity of calculating all the probabilities, the one that is playing with luck. And then in the front line we have the soldiers, and we have the people that is actually dying, that have to face the danger and that have a very direct emotional connection with the conflict. Something indeed very, very platonic. Again, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope this video gave you an idea of how deep is Clausewitz's thought. I think it's a fascinating figure, an absolutely underestimated thinker when it comes to his philosophy, because I think he truly is a good, decent, and excellent philosopher. He's an excellent philosopher, philosophizing about a topic that is very, very difficult to philosophize about. So I hope this video, and I hope the rest of the videos, help you understand and appreciate better his philosophy. Thank you very much for watching, and see you the next time.